Hello and welcome everybody to Network 2020's briefing on technology and democracy. This is part of Network 2020's State of Democracy series. I'm Courtney Doggart and I'm the president of Network 2020. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time, and for those of you who have joined us already and have heard this many times, thank you for listening to it again. But Network 2020, we are an inclusive international community that bridges the gap between the private sector and foreign policy worlds. So we do a number of programs that are both educational and also research driven, but we're really looking at how we can highlight highlight innovative solutions to foreign policy challenges. So we do that in a number of ways. Please do check out our website, network2020.org, and we're on YouTube. You can always check out these briefings on YouTube after, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all the places. So please follow us because we have a lot of information out there. So with that, it is a pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Oh, sorry, I forgot we have just a little bit about the State of Democracy series. So this is our third in this series. Our next one will be in about a couple of weeks when we're looking at democracy and protest movements, and the last will be looking at democracy versus economic stability. So and all the past briefings are available on YouTube as well. So I'd love to introduce our speakers today. We have first Matthew Feeney, who is the director of Cato Institute's Project on Emerging Technologies. He's really looking at the intersection of new technologies and civil liberties. So that's his bent, as you can see. He's very widely published, and we're very happy to have him with us today. And as well, we have Billy Perigo, who is a staff writer at Time Magazine and Time Magazine's international team. He is based in London. He's really focused a lot on tech policy. In addition to tech policy, he's really focused on the US-based social media scene and how those platforms are impacting politics. So we are very lucky to have both of them today. Unfortunately, Maya Wang, who is at Human Rights Watch, who's going to be able to give us the angle of how autocracies versus democracies handle technology. Unfortunately, she's under the weather today and she cannot join us, but hopefully we can have her at a briefing in the future. So with that, I'm going to start this briefing, which in many ways is a really difficult one in this State of Democracy series. It's one of the most difficult ones I found to wrangle. I think because so many of the other briefings look at what has been or what is with a little bit of light forecasting. Today's focus, I think, is really largely on what is to come, sort of this great unknown as governments and companies and citizens alike are rifling through a veritable Pandora's box of technology. And we're getting caught in this web of profits and power and convenience. And there are really very few rules of the road. And as we muddle through, new technology and new applications of that technology continue to be developed. And the power of the tech that already exists is rapidly reshaping our societies, often before we even realize what has happened. And all of this is taking place against a backdrop of geopolitical shifts, really a values contest, many would say, between China, the US, and each's partners and allies. So there's really a lot to dig into here and a lot of unknowns. So I hope that everyone will ask really good questions in the Q&A portion because there's really just a lot to dig into here. But I'm going to start off with you, Billy. We titled this briefing, How to Wield a Double-Edged Sword. And you're looking at the intersection of technology and democracy globally, tech policy. What are some of the trends that you've observed, both for good or for ill, just to kind of set the scene for us, when you're looking at this through a very broad lens over time? What are the trends that you've seen?
Hey, Courtney, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to get into this in detail. I think, it's a bit of a cliche answer, but the double-edged sword vision is absolutely true for social media companies. I mean, they love to talk about this, but they have brought people together. They have changed, or at least facilitated, a lot of change in society over the last 10, 15 years. We've seen a lot of social movements grow out of them. We've seen social norms change because of the discourse that people can have that simply wasn't being had before. But what we're also seeing is, to a large extent, a kind of downstream impact on politics. I think most of the people in the Silicon Valley world probably started only belatedly to realize this around 2016 with Trump being elected. And from here in London, we could have given you a warning a few months before with the kind of campaigning that was happening around the Brexit referendum. And what really happened there was that kind of populist right-wingers were kind of able to seize on the ways that these platforms could be used for political campaigning in a way that many of the progressives who kind of, what we're really seeing is social change from on the progressive side of things, have not really been able to translate into the political realm. So after that point, we had, and it was a slow process, we had social media companies beginning to become clearer about instituting a set of rules, a kind of universalized set of rules about what you could and couldn't do on these platforms. And as a result of that, what we've seen is governments kind of cracking down now and coming in over the last 18 months to 2 years. Almost every country around the world has come in and said, look, we are regulating social media companies, and the broader internet more broadly, saying that these Silicon Valley elites should not be the ones to set the rules for our public discourse. And what's really interesting about this is that we're seeing it from the right and from the left and from the center. And so when you say that technology is a double-edged sword, and if I interpret that through the lens of social media, it's very accurate, because not only do you have centrist neoliberal governments saying we shouldn't be regulated by the Silicon Valley elites, what you're also seeing is authoritarian leaning governments saying, hang on, this is an outrage, you can't do this either. But for those kinds of governments, it's a double-edged sword, because these social media platforms were very effective tools for delivering them to power. They're effective campaigning tools, but they are also spaces where opposition and the free press do to some extent flourish, even though obviously the free press has been impacted by the kind of decimation of the business model. And so I think there is a lot to be said for the accuracy of that double-edged sword perspective from both sides.
Thank you. Well, Matt, turning to you a little bit, we talked just a little bit about social media now. So some of the biggest issues when it comes to the development and deployment of new technologies is who has the power and who writes the rules, as Billy was just saying, right? There's a lot of people in Silicon Valley who are writing the rules. And increasingly, as Billy said, we're seeing calls for increased regulation of social media companies. What is the corollary in other tech realms? Social media is but one of the ways in which tech is reshaping our lives. So what about things like surveillance and deepfakes? How can democracies successfully balance the protection of individual liberties with the society shaping power of those technologies as well?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think in the global context of the conversation is an opportunity, but also makes it a little more difficult, of course, because all of these different countries and jurisdictions we're talking about have different regulations and rules. So in the American context, I think it's a difficult conversation because the First Amendment remains a significant barrier to a lot of the kind of regulations that we've seen around the world. But the double-edged sword discussion, I think, is something you can apply to surveillance even in the American context, where there's concern not only concern about law enforcement surveillance and as well as nation state surveillance, but also the surveillance from private companies. There's more and more discussion about so-called surveillance capitalism. This, which isn't a phrase I, particularly endorse, but I accept it as a concern. There are worries that not only are these so-called big tech companies like the Facebooks and the Googles of the world influencing elections and speech, but they're also gathering a lot of information that some people find intuitively somewhat creepy that that's going on, but there's also concerns about how law enforcement harvest that information for their own ends. I think in surveillance and free speech, I think we have to be aware of alternatives that don't oftentimes make headlines. So, for example, when thinking about speech, for example, we're very focused on Facebook and Google, but we shouldn't forget that there's also 8chan and Gab, and there are encrypted channels where people can gather to have conversations that nation states find impossible to surveil. Similarly, when talking about surveillance, there's discussions about very prominent firms and prominent agencies, but oftentimes a lot of smaller encrypted devices and ways to tackle surveillance oftentimes get unmentioned. What I think is important in all of these contexts is to try and ensure that the conversation is around something particular. I think too often there's a knee-jerk reaction to particular technologies per se, and I'm not someone who views technology or a particular device as good or evil by definition. And we're stuck in this difficult situation where social media, I think, has arguably been one of the greatest innovations since the invention of the printing press, for people to exchange ideas, find people of like minds, and to connect with people all across the world. But that's for good people and bad people. And it's not clear to me that we've figured out a good way to untangle that phenomenon.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that is the case. We're still really working hard on figuring out how to untangle all of that. And I think one really interesting piece, and in doing some research for this briefing too, I was watching some interesting videos just about how we're writing the algorithms that can read all the data. So part of it is that there's so much data or information out there, and then the other part is that we're getting really good at figuring out how to write the algorithms that can also sift through it. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but Billy, I think one example of this you wrote about recently, and that's about how Facebook banned Myanmar's military from the platform, but its algorithms are still promoting pro-military content. So what does this situation say about where we are in terms of regulating the impacts of technology that might have roots that go a level deeper? Is regulation the solution, or do we need to look at like who and how these other algorithms are being developed? Like in short, is the genie out of the bottle already?
So I think that's a false equivalence to some extent. A lot of the most progressive regulation that has been proposed says to these companies, look, you need to be more transparent about how your algorithms work. That's what the EU has suggested, at least. And I think, tech journalists everywhere would have their lives been made a lot easier by legislation like that having an effect, because at the end of the day, we do not know exactly how these algorithms work. But as for the Myanmar story, just briefly, what happened there was a Global Witness report found earlier last week that Facebook pages that promoted pro-military content in Myanmar, which is banned under Facebook's Myanmar-specific rules, were being shared by the platform itself, even though they had content on it which broke those rules. Now, we're talking about two different algorithms here. Facebook doesn't have one algorithm that kind of rules the entire site. You have Facebook's main algorithm, I guess you could call it, which deals with ranking content, deciding which content comes first on your list and on your newsfeed, sorry. And you have page recommendation algorithms, which try and tell you which pages you should like next, and therefore, spend more time on the platform. And it's those that, they work well. They have grown Facebook into a multi-hundred billion dollar company. The algorithms that Facebook is trying to build to detect hate speech, incitement to violence, etc., do not work as well. These are younger, firstly, than Facebook's content ranking algorithms, because the company only started making them once it realized that it was getting a lot of backlash for having a lot of harmful content on its site. And crucially, they only work, or at least they work differently in different languages, because you need to have a language-specific algorithm to detect content in any language. Now, Facebook was caught on the back foot in 2017 when the Burmese military, the Myanmar military, and lots of political figures in the country were using Facebook, which, by the way, is effectively the entire internet in Myanmar. It's synonymous with the internet. It's the most widely used social network. Facebook didn't have any Burmese-speaking content moderators in that country, and as a result, it was unable to kind of stem the flow of hate speech against the Rohingya Muslim minority, and that effectively culminated, shall we say, in a genocide, a military, what the UN has said was a campaign carried out with genocidal intent, I should say, which resulted in more than 1 million Rohingya being forced to flee across the border to Myanmar, and a campaign of rape and murder and such. And Facebook only after that point, after receiving lots of backlash from the human rights world, developed an algorithm that could even work in the language of Burmese. And one of the problems that I came across in my reporting on the issue was that even now, a few years later, 3-4 years later, that the algorithms that Facebook is using to detect hate speech in that language are not comprehensive. And that is part of the reason why Facebook's algorithms that work well, which are the content promotion algorithms that I've said algorithms like 100 times, the programs that help Facebook to encourage you to like certain pages are pushing pages that carry that content that hasn't been found by the algorithms that are meant to detect hate speech into people's feeds. So, at risk of sounding overly complicated, some of Facebook's algorithms work well, which are the ones that are devoted to growing its business and growing its user base. However, specifically in languages where you have a small number of users, potentially not very economically important to a multi-billion-dollar company users, the algorithms are not exactly what the AI isn't going to save us from these problems anytime soon, at least.
So just as a follow-up question to that, you talked a little bit early on in your answer to this question about the transparency laws that the EU has passed. And then when it comes to regulation in these types of cases, how do you get companies like Facebook to improve, let's say, the algorithms or take the actions that aren't necessarily going to drive the bottom line when it comes to other languages? How do you see, in terms of like the regulatory sphere, is it EU, US, rest of world? How is that shaking out? And is there any sort of cohesive approach that you're seeing?
That's a really good question. And I think the answer so far is that we haven't. There's an initiative called the Global Network Initiative, which, as I understand it, is trying to convince the governments of the free world to kind of club together and say, here is a kind of set of standards that we expect all social media companies to adhere to, safeguarding these freedoms, firstly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, etc., freedom of expression, but also potentially outlawing X, Y, and Z harmful outcomes of platforms. As yet, we haven't really seen anything like that happen. The most lots of people in the EU would say, if this bloc of 27 countries can pass this law, which hasn't been passed yet, then that will have enough of an effect on these platforms that operate everywhere to just change their rules globally. But then the counterpoint to that is we see, for example, Facebook in India is another topic that I've been doing a lot of reporting on. And India, for those who don't know, is a country that has more Facebook users than any other in the world. It, until very recently, Facebook had a head of policy in India who was very close to the ruling party, and in fact still does, but a different one. And what was happening there was the Wall Street Journal did a report where they found that this Facebook head of policy had intervened in order to keep a BJP ruling party lawmakers' account active on the site, even though they had broken the site's rules. And that really raises this question for a company that has a market that is so important. So India is a really important market for Facebook. Is Facebook going to punish the ruling party for breaking its own rules in that country if the result or the expectation is that the ruling party of that country will then deny you important business opportunities? And that's a really significant question in countries like India and in other countries around the world where Facebook may prioritize its income over other considerations.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. Switching gears a little, Matthew, in some ways, we're really just seeing the tip of the iceberg, I think, when it comes to technology, data, and the potential for control that it presents. Biometric data, for example, I think really has a chilling potential to give holders of that data unprecedented insights into the movements, purchases, and habits of individuals, but also, and this is what I found astounding and somewhat terrifying, also to their physiological reactions to events and clues to how they think and feel. What specific actions do governments and companies need to take now to ensure that the useful benefits of that data do not get overtaken by their corrosive power if they're put in the wrong hands?
Yeah, good question. I've thought mostly about this in the context of facial recognition, which I think is one of the technologies or set of tools that people are most concerned about. And certainly, it really sets off, I think, people's creepiness radar when people think about the ability of being identified when out and about in ordinary life. And I think this is most concerning in the context of law enforcement. And even in the United States, which is one of these liberal democracies, at least half of American adults are already in some kind of database that can be queried via facial recognition tools. And that's in large part thanks to the fact that a lot of states volunteer their driver's license photos to law enforcement for these kind of queries. And that's very concerning, it seems to me, because the vast majority of people in those databases aren't wanted for any crimes, haven't committed any crimes. But you only have to take a fleeting glance at the history of American surveillance to realize that the list of groups and people who have found themselves on the receiving end of the surveillance state is it's a long and diverse list. And so that's in the United States. I mean, in other countries, most notably probably China, this technology has just snowballed to a degree that would make George Orwell grin, I suppose. Something else that I think should be kept in mind here, though, is that the technology has benefits. We might not think of facial recognition as a technology with many benefits, but we can imagine visiting a grocery store and not having to get out a wallet. You can just walk out, or standing in queues for train stations and airports. My main concern in this kind of context is to make sure that when it comes to the collection of this kind of data, that law enforcement cannot access it with good reason, that the government only has access to images and faces associated with people wanted for violent crimes and other serious offenses. What I think we need to do is to make sure that those beneficial applications of this kind of technology don't get jettisoned because we have legitimate surveillance concerns. But that's oftentimes difficult, of course. One of the struggles I think of anyone who works works on privacy is you quickly find that people are very willing to give up a lot of their personal privacy because they don't ever think they'll be on the receiving end of surveillance. So yes, I've written before about how there should be limits on government access to this data, but it's a difficult issue given the potential for abuse.
Thank you. And apologies if we're having technological difficulties. It seemed I dropped off there, so I hope everyone can still hear me. Billy, I'm going to ask you one final question before we turn to the Q&A box. And that is, in your mind, how can the remaining democracies revitalize and fortify themselves in a way that really lets the good of technology flourish and to minimize the erosion of democratic norms?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say, just to go, well, very quickly back to a point that Matt made, and potentially also this is an answer to your question as well, is that we shouldn't necessarily think of advancements in specifically AI, which is an increasing umbrella over what we mean when we say technology these days. We shouldn't necessarily think of developments in that space as intrinsically good. It's not quite as linear as technological development used to be in the past. You only need to look at news reports to see the ways that these systems can inflict discrimination against people based on the data inputs that they've been trained with. And also, as these systems become more complex, it becomes harder and harder for anyone, even the people who design them, to kind of give a convincing answer as to why they have come up with the answers, the outputs that they've produced. So I think an acknowledgement of that, and an acknowledgement of the kind of basic fundamentals of how AI systems work is really fundamental to kind of going forward in a society, and making sure that as far as they do impact our lives in the future, these systems do so equitably and not perpetuate forms of discrimination that have existed in the past. As for your broader question, I mean, look, nobody is really going to agree on what the best approach for regulating tech platforms is. We see that in the fact that it's basically become the center of a lot of the culture wars that are being had in different countries around the world. I think, yeah, broadly, it's not necessarily an issue that regulation can solve alone. Regulations are part of it, but it needs to be, in all the democracies that still exist around the world, they need to kind of look within and find answers to the questions of why democracy seems to be being eroded, and whether that is cuts to public spending or other reasons. I think those should be looked at, as well as the issue of both regulating and also using technology to build a kind of society that everyone wants to live in and that benefits all of its constituents.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to the Q&A box now. I see some questions coming in, and please feel free, if you're watching, to put any questions in the Q&A box. This first one's for you, Matthew, and it's from Phoebe Strom, who asks, why is it legitimate to collect a large amount of personal data in the first place by entities that don't need it? Name, address, date of birth, purchases, websites I visit, interests. And then secondly, if that can't be reversed by regulations, if this is a statement, she says, pay me for my data. So kind of reversing or turning that into a question. What do you see when you're looking out? So question one, why do they need this data in the first place? And two, are there movements to to have that data be monetized and be paid for, reimbursed to the individuals that are giving it up?
Yeah, good questions. I mean, on the first one, on the need, I think it depends on the specific service, right? So Google, Facebook, and other prominent companies are going to gather as much information as they can to sell their product, which is digital advertising space most of the time. So knowing your address and your name, your all this information about them is very valuable to them. And they would argue, well, you volunteer the data when you use the service and no one's forcing you. So that would be their argument. There are also companies that gather a lot of personal data, even though it's rather limited, it's still very revealing, such as an example might be Uber, for example, knows, certainly an address that you're going to frequent, but you can tell a lot about someone by where they are traveling. And oftentimes you might not even need to know their gender or their age or their religious affiliation. You don't need to be Sherlock Holmes to figure a lot of that out. On the second question on the buying of data, this is an idea you see often in these kind of debates. People will say, well, I should be paid if you're using my data or something along those lines. The problem is data isn't like other property. I mean, if you think of traditional property like I don't know, a pencil or a house or a car, you have a bundle of rights associated with that, like the right to exclude or the right to sell or to lease it. With data, it's not really so simple. So, for example, this Zoom call, this Zoom is gathering a lot of data, but is that data about you, me, Billy, the 67 participants? What if I want to sell it, but other people don't? It's data about, it's not data about any specific person. And so that, data just isn't like other property. So I don't actually think the ability to sell data would make the privacy or the democracy questions any better. But I'm open to suggestions, but I remain unconvinced at the moment.
Thank you. We have another question here, and Billy, I'll turn to you for this one. In thinking about the Arab Spring and more recently, I think protests in Hong Kong, is technology making it easier or harder to organize social or political movements? Are open source programmers with unchecked freedom and big tech connected to the state hindering political change? So I think that this almost kind of alludes to what you're saying in India. So what's kind of going on behind the scenes between big tech and governments, and is that making it easier to organize protests, harder? What are you seeing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's funny because the Arab Spring was back in the day, it was always the example that tech companies would turn to first as an example of how they were bringing positive social change to the world. But basically since 2010, 2011, what we've seen really is powerful actors being better at leveraging their power over social media than the ability of users, protesters, to leverage their own kind of power through those websites. So obviously we are seeing both. But I mean, look back to the Middle East in 2021, even a month ago, 2 months ago, we had lots of Palestinians saying that their voices were being silenced by the Facebook algorithm because, sorry, I've used algorithm very wrongly there, which Facebook's PR team would call me up on. They were being silenced by Facebook, they would say, because of lots of flags in their posts, or, for example, there was the word martyr, I think, and maybe another one which, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, right? The holy mosque in Jerusalem, third holiest site in Islam. Lots of posts, there was a protest at that site, lots of Palestinian posts mentioning what was happening there got blocked or removed. Facebook said that they'd made a mistake because they'd accidentally considered those posts to be referring to a banned terror group, which, mention of which is blocked on its platforms. So that is an example of an artificial intelligence that Facebook has built in order to remove what it thinks is in that case mention of dangerous organizations or terrorist activity, having an unforeseen effect on, you know, what most people in the world would agree is one of the world's most marginalized groups. And this is an example of how you see the power imbalances that already exist in the world being reflected in social media. That's the way that a Palestinian rights activist put it to me, at least. Because really social media and the, you know, the economic and political power that these companies have in the world as well reflects onto the ways that they are having impacts on people, if that makes sense. So the impact is going to be different on someone who is part of a marginalized group to someone who lives in New York. And I think lots of dictators in the Arab world have realized that as well. And, you know, especially even the state of Israel as well, they cooperate very closely with Facebook. Facebook cooperates very closely with them to remove reports of what Israel tells them is terrorist content. Facebook wouldn't answer me when I asked them the question of whether the reports that the Israel cybersecurity team sends them about hate content in Palestine, whether that is fed into their algorithms for detecting future examples, which raises the question, are certain states having an impact over what is considered to be hate speech in Arabic? How transparent are those processes? Yeah, so that's an example potentially of real world power dynamics having an impact on you know, the virtual world.
Thank you. Matthew, turning to you, we have a question from Anne Ryan, who is asking how IT interactions with the human body are being described and documented. So in short, who's, and she also asked who is publishing, or I think studying this. So who's taking a look at how the IT interactions with our physical body are being, I think, you know, described, documented, collected, and who's studying this?
Sorry, so if you broke up slightly there. So just who's studying the relationship between the devices that are measuring our physical bodies? And
so yeah.
Oh, I mean, I think, you know, there are tons of centers around. At least, you know, my focus is mostly in the domestic US, but it seems like more and more universities have centers dedicated to emerging technology issues. I mean, particularly Arizona State University has one of the best collections of scholars when it comes to these sort of issues. As you know, and you can find centers for emerging technologies and internet study at Harvard or Duke and a bunch of other institutions. What you'll find, I think, is when you're especially interested in these kind of companies, you'll find that they keep a lot of data to themselves, and that makes sense. It's oftentimes difficult to study what's going on here. I remember a few years ago when Uber was, you know, trying to make itself look, I suppose, trendy and cool, when they released a blog post about how they could track how many people in a certain city were engaging in one-night stands. And of course, they quickly had a backlash. I don't think they were quite expecting the reaction to it, but people intuitively found that rather creepy. But that's not data that researchers are going to be able to find by themselves very easily. It's oftentimes very difficult, but there is an interesting study or field of study on things like the effect of certain technologies on moods. I think especially with social media, there's widespread, I would say quite legitimate concern associated with how this affects children in particular. Young girls, it seems, especially seem to have found ways to weaponize this kind of technology in bad ways. But you know, I think there's a lot of research out there to be done, but you'll often find that these companies are pretty secretive when it comes to their own data.
Got it. Okay, so for better or for worse, at least it's not always out there in the public realm, but then it means that people aren't really able to study what's going on with that. We have a question. I'll turn to you first for this, Billy, and then Matthew, if you want to chime in, you can as well. To Nikita Kozhemyakin asks, why does Facebook and other social media platforms have the right to decide what information can be placed on those platforms? So why can they promote opposition and protest channels and delete Central TV's accounts? Why are they able to do what they want? And then sort of like what, and just to kind of jump off of that, you know, what are some of the different regulatory models that you're seeing? And we talked a little bit about this, whether it's government regulation or private company regulation, but who's setting the rules of the road and why are they able to do this? And I think that this is a very, you know, Nikita's in Russia, so he's asking this probably from a Russia perspective as well too.
Well, the First Amendment answer to that question is that they are private companies and you're using their services, so they have the right to decide what is and isn't posted on them. That's the boring legal answer. They are also shielded from prosecution for any illegal content that users may post on them under American law as well. So basically, they can really do whatever they like. Facebook would probably say, in answer to your question, that, look, we are trying to, this is me channeling my inner Facebook PR person who lives rent-free in my brain. Look, we're trying to build a space that is safe for all of our users. We don't allow stuff that almost everyone would agree is bad on our platform, like, for example, terrorist content, hate speech, you know, child exploitation, the list goes on. The narrative that it is censorship has been brought up by both the right and the left. We just talked about how Palestinian rights activists are accusing Facebook of censorship, but really it has been brought up with a lot of fervor by people in the kind of conservative right in America, at least. And you know, it's a valid question. Should Silicon Valley billionaires have the right to decide what does and doesn't count as allowed in this public square that more and more of us are using as, you know, to conduct our discourse day after day? The answer is probably no, but Nick Clegg, Facebook's PR guy, says no governments have told us what we can and can't say. So until we have governments telling us that, we're going to try and do it ourselves. And Facebook would also say that they've set up this external board, the oversight board, which is staffed by you know, 20 or so luminaries from around the world in the fields of law and, you know, journalism and stuff like that, human rights, to take the most difficult decisions off their hands effectively and to rule effectively. Zuckerberg called it a Supreme Court for Facebook, to rule on whether Facebook's decisions are correct or incorrect. And different social media companies are trying to deal with it in different ways. Twitter is trying to decentralize their approach to misinformation and fact checking by having, you know, the Twitter community come in and say, look, you're wrong, and then centering those fact checks, as it were. There is no centralized Ministry of Truth, as to go to echo Matt's use of Orwell there. And so any kind of centralized system of deciding what is right and wrong on any platform will be controversial. But that's kind of the problem that we signed up to when we all signed up to a universalized you know, social network. So it's a problem that will not go away, but let's just say that authoritarians have found that complaining about social media censorship is a very effective way to galvanize support when lots of their actual policies are not being implemented properly.
Yeah, I would only add a few things. I do think it's correct that when Billy said, yeah, the boring answer, at least in the American context, is private companies can disassociate with content they find objectionable. And there's a lot of legal content that people find objectionable, right? So pornography, images of animals being crushed to death, or videos of people being shot. I mean, all of that in the US context is legal speech, and the US doesn't have hate speech laws. But nonetheless, a private company is allowed to develop its own rules and to say, well, that may be true, but we're going to disassociate from pornography and, ISIS beheading videos because we choose to form a company consistent with certain values. And that kind of content was discussed a lot, especially during, I think, the Syrian civil war, when it was at its height. All this kind of content was very concerning. In a time of COVID, though, more of this has turned on to public health, which is, well, how many debates about people's health that could have repercussions do you want to allow? These debates about, if someone joins an anti-vaccination group and manages to convince 2,000 people not to take vaccines, that's legal for them to try and be persuasive, but should Facebook allow that? Before COVID, there was the Tide Pod challenge, children putting, Tide Pods detergent into their mouth as part of the dare. Again, it's legal, but it might not be a good idea for people to put detergent in their mouths. And it's all about this question of legitimacy. And Billy's right that Facebook has tried to make itself look more legitimate as some sort of policeman of speech by saying, oh, but we've hired a lot of these free speech experts, including, I should add, for transparency, an employee of the Cato Institute, to oversee some of these decisions. But it seems, at least, that only goes so far. At the outbreak of COVID, Facebook says, well, we don't know anything about medicine, so we'll turn to the CDC. And what the CDC says, we'll just help that as a proxy for our content moderation system. But that just kicks the can only a little bit down the road. And they can establish a Supreme Court for Facebook. But if you're an American conservative who's skeptical about how Facebook moderates content, being told that Facebook has sent up a Supreme Court is of very little reassurance to you. I do think the future will be slightly more decentralized. I find a lot of these content moderation systems very centralized and pretty boring. So I do hope that the future of the internet is one where there's more decentralization and user control. But that's not the case in the YouTubes and the Facebooks of the world. That's for sure.
So a follow-up, and I have a couple questions that are asking along this particular line of thought. And I'll start with you, Matthew, our libertarian in the group, to see how you respond to this, and then over to you, Billy. Why do we, and this is from John Allen, who asks, why do we continue to deal with these universal technology and other critical issues, from universal technology questions and other critical issues from a national and corporate perspective? Isn't it time to move to a global form of governance where ideas, decisions, and regulations are made with humanity as the highest priority? So is one of these solutions, let's not deal with this, maybe it's not governments, maybe it's not corporates, but is there more of a universal way to address this question?
There may be, and people are welcome to try and come up with some proposals, but I haven't seen anything that would make everyone across the board happy. The problem is, one of the great things about social media, but also something that I think in this discussion we've realized is a cost, is we live in a really diverse world where people have many different values and different priorities, and they're governed by nation states that range from the totalitarian to the liberal. The idea that if you're sitting in California trying to come up with a system that's going to make everyone in all of these regimes and jurisdictions and communities happy, I think is optimistic and probably unworkable. The problem is that if you're a big company like Facebook, you have a legal obligation to adhere to the law in all the countries where you're operating, and that takes a lot of resources in compliance there. What I worry about when people talk about, say, a global system is ultimately I view it as potentially anti-competitive. Because the Googles and the Facebooks of the world can hire more lawyers and engineers than God. And if you have a system that all the countries, let's just imagine every country agreed on one standard, it's going to be difficult to be a startup to ensure compliance with that standard when you have billions of people potentially using the platform. Facebook and Google will be able to adhere to whatever regulations emerge. That's something worth keeping in mind here. And I don't want to live in a world where Facebook and Google are around forever. I want there to be competition. I want there to be a vibrant marketplace where people who want to express themselves have many different places to do that. And they do at the moment, for sure. But I do think one way to make Facebook stronger is to ensure that they have to comply with a transnational legal system. But as ever, I'm open to suggestions. If someone's written a paper outlining such a suggestion, I'd welcome the opportunity to read it.
Yeah, I just add to that. I don't know if you guys were following the US government report that was meant to be, or that was released last Friday about UFOs. But if if we were all told that aliens existed, then humanity might start to agree on more things. But the unfortunate reality is that we currently don't. I think, John, to answer your question, to go back to what I was saying before, there's an approach that is attempting to get lots of democratic governments to agree on a set of kind of baselines for what rights technology companies should uphold. The wrong approach, in my opinion, would be to kind of aggregate or average out all of the approaches by different countries to allow, authoritarian governments to have their say effectively, because that is not going to be conducive to an open internet or, human rights. But on the other hand, we shouldn't allow the Silicon Valley elites to set the rules either, because then the most marginalized and vulnerable people in the world tend to be the ones who lose out the most.
So as a follow-up to that, we had Richard Fontaine from CNAS join us a few months ago, and he was one of the people who has proposed this idea of like a T20 group to form a group of 20 or so tech-driven democracies, or maybe it's a T12. Sorry, I think it's a T12. I don't want to misstate. But a group of tech-driven democracies to create norms and kind of push back against some of the dangerous use of technology. Is that something that, where it's less about we're coming together to write universal regulations, but let's use some of the global governance tools of, bringing together convening democracies to talk about what some of the problems are and how to address them?
I would have to, go ahead, Billy.
No, you go first.
Okay. I would have to look at the proposal. I mean, my first question is, I don't know what a tech-driven democracy is or why there are 12, but I would have to take a look. The problem is that I think there's a tension here, which is it's not a problem with democracy per se that a lot of people have bad ideas, right? And that there's, and in the US context with the rise of Donald Trump, a lot of Americans especially were looking at the country and thinking, gosh, I didn't know that there were so many people who were sympathetic to this kind of politics. And, there was, in the wake of Charlottesville, a lot of Americans were looking at the television, I think, appalled that you could even gather that number of white supremacists into a town in Virginia. But those people aren't going to go away because countries agree on a set of standards. And at least in the American context, they have a right to express their views peacefully online and in protests. Violence, of course, being illegal is a different matter. So I worry about how much of these standards, one, would even be legal in most of these countries, and two, what that kind of agreement looks like. I agree with Billy that the averaging out of concerns or approaches to this is unlikely to be feasible. But I would have to take a look at the proposal in full, but I suppose call me skeptical at first glance.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, states tend not to be the most progressive ideologues on this anyway. I mean, I think we should be listening to civil society a lot more. And as for the most technologically advanced countries, we shouldn't really be listening to them either. I mean, we've spoken about Myanmar and Palestine. Like, these are two places which would definitely not be on that list. Myanmar for fairly good reasons, because it's an authoritarian state. But these are the places whose stories we need to be paying attention to more than, you know, Bob from Arizona who's had his post deleted, and may well have other forms of recourse to settling that score. Yeah, I think that is an important thing to remember.
Thank you. One question that I have now that I'd like to ask, and it's too bad that Maya's not here, but I hope that both of you might be able to take a quick stab at it before we wrap. But it's about this idea of innovation, right? And so if power is often in the hands of innovators, with the countries that often are making the best technology get a good foothold. And so looking at, this actually was about a story that Maya, or something that Maya was talking about, I believe, which is China's navigation system, Baidu, is now, I think, leading the US in the US's GPS technology worldwide. So, you know, with this idea, again, that if power is in the hands of the innovators and the ones that have the greatest market share, let's say, how can the world's remaining democracies retain their edge in innovation and product development, so that the end result of tech innovation and the data that it produces stays in the hands of those who will protect that data?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll
first, and then we'll go to Billy.
Okay, I suppose I will channel my libertarian here. I think if you want there to be more people who have liberal outlooks on life and embrace, you know, those sort of values, you should let them move to those countries. I think, you know, an answer is an immigration policy. I think when you look around the world, it is far too hard for talented people working in technology and science to move to countries where those talents would be best realized. And too often, I think liberal democracies spend time educating and training people who come from more authoritarian countries who then return. But I think it would be great if the US opened its doors to more, you know, in this context we're talking about China, but it would be great if it opened its doors to every country in the world and said, if you come here and are educated here, you can stay here. And you don't need to go home. That would be one way to do it. But also I think there needs to be, you know, that's an approach the US should take, but I wish more countries would follow suit. The conversation in the US, I think, has become rather scary, with people talking about Chinese students as if they're, you know, wings of the Chinese state and spies. And I don't want to, you know, say that there's no risk of espionage or anything like that, but I think you really are on a worrying rhetorical slippery slope here when you allow for that kind of debate. So my answer wouldn't even be a tech policy answer. I'd say, you know, a more liberal immigration policy would be a good first step.
Billy.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't specialize in AI, but from what I have heard, it seems like the way we go about most things in our lives, and the structure of the economy and the structure of our rights as a whole, is going to be hugely impacted by basically what kind of supercomputer is developed first. And, you know, you would be, you know, it's right to wonder about what happens if a authoritarian government is the first to develop, you know, an all-powerful artificial general intelligence, as it's known technically, artificial intelligence that can do multiple things at once, and you know, answer any question, etc. As I said, I'm not an expert. So I think what the result of that fear should be is thinking very deeply about the way the kind of the safeguards that should be constructed into the, you know, adversary to that system, and building, you know, building very real protections into the AI research that is going on here.
Thank you both. This is a very difficult conversation to have, just because it's so wide ranging, and so there's just so much that needs to be in some ways forecast, and it's very, very difficult to resolve. So thank you both for taking the time today. And thank you everyone in the audience for your excellent questions. Our next briefing is Monday, July 5th. Oh no, not Monday, July 15th. Sorry, that there's actually a typo there. I believe it's Thursday, July 15th. And that is on protest, power, and democracy: a global reckoning. So this is also part of the State of Democracy series. So we're really looking at what happened in the year of protest pre-COVID. If anyone can remember back to 2019, and there were protests on 6 continents and just a lot happening. And we're going to be taking a look at what the end result is, what the end results of those protests are, and where protest sits as a tool of democracy. So please do RSVP to that. And again, we are a nonprofit. We would love to keep these briefings free and open to everyone around the world. No donation is too small, so if you can donate, please do. And again, Matthew, Billy, thank you for an excellent discussion today. I appreciate it. Take care.